So many, like upwards of, let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then there is someone who is just credited as part of the team for artwork. So yeah, I think that only further, describes it as a project as opposed to just a traditional pop album. So
it looks like, unfortunately, he died at the age of 40.
Yeah, I was just seeing that.
AIDS-related illnesses. And like Nick Drake, that's not Nick Drake related, but he also never achieved great success during his lifetime, but was later very influential.
I get the feeling he wasn't searching to be a mainstream, but nothing about this screams to me that he was making this to break through.
It also doesn't seem like he, based on the little I see here, wasn't like suffering from severe mental illness like Nick Drake was. So I think he was living his life.
He interestingly enough, he had a career as like in the disco scene of New York, which is funny because I can't think of anything that would sound less like this album than like straight ahead disco music. So clearly different. It's like he also, by the way, I was fascinated by his bio because it's an interesting bio. Do you know that he came very close to joining the Talking Heads?
Oh wow. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
was he going to be the bassist instead of Tina Weymouth?
In 1976, right? So here's the thing taken from Wikipedia here. In 1976, Russell was in talks to join Talking Heads, who were a trio at the time. So I guess that would have meant no Tina Weymouth, right? She came later. He recorded an acoustic version of the song "Psycho Killer" with the band, playing cello. He would also collaborate on arrangements for early Talking Heads songs. He stated that they became friends, but he ended up not joining the band. They were all from art school and were into looking severe and cool. I was never into that. I was from music school, and I had long hair at the time.
Interesting. I wonder if you can hear that Psycho Killer version. That would be cool.
That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Yeah. He kind of was involved with tons of people. Like, remember we talked Desmond Child? He was involved with him in the late 70s. He's like with a lot of the divas of the disco era, like Patti LaBelle and Gloria Gaynor. He was involved with them. He also at one point, guys, we talked about like how this one did not seem for things. He at one point had a desire to create the Disco White Album was a goal of his at one point. Which, wow. Yeah. So it's a very, very interesting, very, very interesting bio. I'd say. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So.
Well, I'm glad I listened to it. I like it.
Yeah, I like learning stuff.
Yeah, expanded the definition of music in some ways. But.
So, okay. We are now on to album number 5, Guadalcanal Diary, 2x4. Matt, run the numbers, and then Josh gets first take, I think.
Yes, he does. All right, so 2x4 by Guadalcanal Diary comes in number 5,647 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums. So we're not covering this from this list. 553 in 1987, 45,206 of all time. It's their second highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, behind 1984's Walking in the Shadow of the Big Man. This album is not on Rolling Stone's list, and Guadalcanal Diary is ranked number 4,151 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums.
Interesting. We're not even listening to their highest rated album.
We are not, no. And this, John, did this come? Their bio here is very short for this record. Did this come from Paste? Did you look at Paste at all?
Choice came from?
Yeah.
No, this is post-punk flashcards.
Oh, it is. Okay. Well, this is. I only asked that because this was included, I guess, pasted in 80 best albums of the 80s, and this was 64 on that list. So they liked it too.
Yeah, I guess this would be post-punk. Who knows? Well, the first thing I wrote down was, this sounds like REM, and almost.
They're from Marietta, Georgia, so add them as another. We've covered a bunch, right? B-52s, Pylon, REM, and throw them in the pile.
Yeah, I think they knew Pylon. I saw, or there was some crossover with them. And I mean, the lead singer even sounds like Michael Stipe at some points in these songs. And so at first listen, I thought they felt like they were kind of derivative or something of REM. I kept making that association, and I think that was, impacting how I listened to the album. But on subsequent listens, I really liked this album, and I thought it was just kind of this solid, almost southern rock, indie rock type of, college rock, I guess, then in the 80s type of album. And the songs are pretty catchy, and they, like Talking Heads, also had a female bass player, which I saw that was interesting. And they kind of have this punchy, like upbeat nature to them on songs like Get Over It and Things Fall Apart, which I think is probably my favorite song on this album. And then Let the Big Wheel Roll, which I put on the montage. They also kind of had this slight, maybe like jangle pop sound to them at times. I like some of the harmonizing that comes in at times on the songs, and it was a fun listen overall. I think it was something I need to listen to a bit more to kind of pick out what made them, I don't know, different or from some of the other bands that we've listened to, because I do feel like they're kind of a second tier or a band that like didn't make it type of band in some ways, or it wasn't as was around at the same time as other bands that did make it, and they're kind of, I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of the impression I got, was like, this is a good album, but like, is it like what makes it special? But that being said, I think it was a very listenable album. I enjoyed kind of the rock vibe to it, and I think they were crafting pretty good songs also. So thumbs up for me.
Yeah, I'm much higher on this album. I love this album, and this was a real gem. Like, I don't get caught off guard as often as I got caught off guard on this album, because touch points of certainly REM, right? And a lot of the music, the jangle pop sort of oriented music in the 80s. I love the variety of the songs on this album. And the thing that really stood out to me was how tight the songs were for a band that I didn't know, and how fun this album would have been to listen to played live. It just... throughout, I didn't think there were really any weak songs on this album. I thought it was very consistent, but it also didn't, because I listened, it's a 13-song album, right? And I liked it enough that I dug into the demos, which was interesting to see how the stuff created. It's kind of remarkable to me that this band was not bigger, because there's songs like Under the Yoke and Let the Big Wheel Roll. They obviously have a Beatles cover on here, and Your Bird Can Sing, which was a pretty good Beatles cover, I have to say. I mean, they didn't reinvent the wheel or anything, but it certainly sounded good. They're in that lineage of pop rock bands, I would say, that we've been talking about quite a bit. And I feel like there's this great lineage of American pop rock bands that, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's because they didn't have enough edge, and if like you look at pictures of them, like they are clearly not a band, right? I'm not knocking them, but they were not playing for aesthetics, right? But they didn't kind of have whatever that, they kind of fell, like the same fate as Pylon. Now Pylon was a little bit more experimental, right? And tied to sort of that Joy Division-y type. Not exactly, but they had elements of that, like when they were there. But it's a really fascinating what if case for me, because even when I researched them, it was sort of like we made our music and then we faded out, right? And in that case, they reminded me of some bands that we covered a little bit earlier in the decade, like the DBs, right, was one that came to mind, and the Feelies, right?
Yes,
these
bands, the Feelies, for sure.
Yeah, and like they even kind of sound like the Feelies a little bit. And you listen to this album, you're like, oh, this album's really good. Like, how the heck is this album like not more well known? And I feel every decade brings stuff with it, right? And I feel like the 80s has given me this never-ending array of groups like, the Soft Boys and, the bands I just mentioned, the Feelies and the DBs, and now this Guadalcanal Diary, like all of these bands that made these eminently listenable, really enjoyable albums that I feel like if they'd come along in like the early 90s, maybe like some of these bands would have broke or had like an MTV single or been played on alt radio, but they just existed in the ether of underground radio and like the music press, and it just continues to fascinate me that I can be completely caught off guard by bands that sound like this, but and not disposable or too derivative, right? I mean, I guess somebody could say they're derivative of REM because the lead singer does take on Michael Stipe's tone, and there is some jangle guitar that I guess you could say is Peter Buck light, but they also go in plenty of different directions that you recognize it's not them. I would say that this is more like Fables / Reckoning as a mix sound REM, if you're going for like a general tone and you want to compare it to REM. But yeah, this one was a strong thumbs up for me. I really liked this album, and it was a great lost find for me.
The other, before Matt jumps in, the other band that came to mind, kind of lineage wise, maybe like the Flaming Groovies or something like that. Also like kind of rock, Beatles inspired, but also, you know, kind of.
I felt like the Flaming Groovies were a little bit more of a 70s band and like Beatles-esque, so they fell more in like that Badfinger, Big Star type of lane, right, where they were kind of doing the Beatles all over. This seems like of its era of the 80s. Like you couldn't make this album in the 70s. And like we've talked about before, the thing that I'm learning about post-punk is a lot of this stuff could have easily slotted in the early 90s as well and would have a lane there. And that was another thing that stood out to me. So,
yeah, this listen, this is one of the most unique listens I think I've had in the entire run of this podcast. Because my initial reaction to this record was very similar to Josh's. The first few songs come on, and I'm like, man, this sounds kind of generic. This is like a poor man's REM.
Yeah.
You know, REM definitely stood out. I'm like, yeah, he sounds like they're trying to do REM riffs and you know, little ditties, and it's just not happening. And I was nonplussed on the first listen, and then as week went on, little by little, this song started like, okay, actually, I think I like this song. Now think I like this song, and now it's like to the point where I like just about all the songs. There's still a couple of songs I'm still warming up to, oddly enough, and I think I think you're right, John. There is variety on here if you kind of, if you're really paying attention here, because you certainly have the Beatles influence, obviously there's a Beatles song on here, which actually has, I really like that version. It's a great song, and they do a great. It really brings out the power pop elements of that song.
Yeah. They are kind of power pop, I think.
Yeah,
too.
and that's kind of like, yeah, that's the Beatles were kind of, a power pop band in their own right as well. They've got some, and then they've got some the variety that you were talking about too, John. That they've got like Little Birds is a little psychedelic. It's got a little kind of dream poppy psychedelia kind of going on. Yep. And then you've got more of like the bar bands, almost like like Let the Big Wheel Roll. Things Fall Apart, and maybe, is it Say Please? You kind of have this more blues rock, Americana kind of vibe.
Yep.
It reminded me a little bit of the band. Is it the who were those? Not Los Lobos, the other guys that we had to listen to on YouTube because they weren't on the. I have to go back and look. I might have to go back in our. It was another kind of bar band Americana group that seemed out of place from the 80s.
Yes, it's the band from LA. What are they called? Yeah. Starts with a B.
The Bastards. Not
the
Blasters. The Blasters. That was it. Yeah.
Yep.
So there's some of those songs, and actually those songs, I think, as it stands right now, those are some of probably my least favorite songs on this. They're the ones that are hitting the least. But the ones that really started kind of, I think Litany, I think it opens up with a really great anthemic kind of, rollicking type song. Under the Yoke, I mean, that's a 90s song. A lot of these songs actually, John, I think fit more in the 90s, the early mid-90s.
Oh, I agree. It felt like an early 90s album.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought that once, I think the second half is stronger for me. Once you get Where Angels Fear to Tread and Winds of Change in particular are just really cool songs. They got like this urgent driving kind of guitar part that's Super catchy. 3 a.m. is a nice song. Is a pretty song. Lips of Steel ends it really, upbeat.
3 a.m. is like the best song Michael Stipe never wrote. It's basically an REM song. It's a great REM song, but that they did, yeah.
And there's and you're right. There's Jangle on here. They slow it down. They kind of go in the blues rock thing. So I'm still warming up to it. I'm surprised because my initial reaction was like, these guys are just ripping off REM, and they're like, it's just generic, and it's like, no. And it's interesting how an initial take like that can sit with you for a little bit, and then you start to go, actually, I think I was pretty wrong about that. I mean, they do sound like REM. That's not, I mean, that I'm like, I still feel that way, but that's not a bad. You could still sound like I love REM, So but do it well, and I think once I got over that hump of my initial whatever that was happening in that moment, I don't know if it was just the mood that I was in or just what I was doing or whatever, but this definitely grew on me, and I think it's still growing on me because I think Get Over It, that was another song that might have been the first song. On the first time I listened to it, where I was like, okay, I started.
It sounds like a Smithereens song a little bit. You know that band, the Smithereens?
That's exactly. Yeah. Yes, I thought of that too, and I remember thinking like that chorus to me. I'm still not huge on the chorus. Like the Get Over. It seems like it's not fully formed. It's kind of. It seemed a little bit lazy. I think it's better now than what I initially thought. But like,
I like that one. Yeah.
So I'm still warming up to that one as well. But yeah, like definitely all those groups that you guys had mentioned already are some of my favorite moments in this decade, the season of the podcast. And
right,
post-punk, man, give me more of it. If that's it's yeah.
It also was unexpected at times because, like you said, like you initially, and I get it because I was like, okay, this is like. I think it hit me much quicker, Matt, than it did to you, that there was a lane that wasn't REM, even though the guy sounds like REM. So it's like, okay, there's an affectation in the singing, but the music is not. Like, and then, like, there's weird things when I was listening to it. I'm like I'll give you an idea. Like, Under the Yoke sounds like an Alice in Chains song.
Yeah,
like if you listen
picked
to
up
it.
on that too.
Yep.
At different times.
Yeah, and it's
with
like,
the bass
so
or something.
there's these weird things where it's like that